We've got some great titles of things that Mr. Davis presented to me.
Aretha Franklin's voice didn't just define soul music, it defined eras of human emotion. Behind the crown, the sequined gowns, and the unmistakable queen of soul presence, there was a side of her that very few truly understood, a deeply sensual, intensely private world she guarded for most of her life. For over 60 years, the world celebrated her power, but rarely glimpsed the woman who loved, desired, and connected with other geniuses on the most intimate level. Because for all the respect Aretha commanded on stage, there were 7 artists she almost never publicly discussed in detail. Some she loved quietly, some she loved fiercely, and a few she kept tucked away in the most guarded part of her heart. These weren't random flings or forgettable encounters. Many of them were profound, complex relationships with men who knew what it meant to carry the burden of genius, to make music that could bring people to tears and still feel alone at the top. Throughout most of her career, she refused to fully name names. She hinted, she laughed things off, she changed the subject. But in her later years, especially as she approached 76, the filter grew thinner. She started to open up more honestly about the men who had shaped her private world. And once you hear who shared her bed, her trust, and her vulnerability, it becomes impossible to see her as just the queen of soul ever again. Some of these men would remain lifelong friends. Others drifted into memory, their roles completed as time moved them apart. But every one of them left fingerprints on the woman behind the microphone. So let's begin with the man who made her heart race in a way almost no one else ever did. Number 1. Sam Cooke, the smooth one she could never quite forget. Aretha Franklin built her legend on emotional honesty. Every note felt lived in. Every run sounded like it had passed through fire and come out transformed. She wasn't just singing songs, she was testifying. Yet beneath the spiritual intensity and composure, Sam Cooke represented a different soundtrack in her life, one of spontaneity, risk, and unfiltered desire. Sam Cooke was effortless charm personified. He could walk into a room and own it without raising his voice. His tone was silk, his presence magnetic, and Aretha was as susceptible as anyone else. They met at a gospel music event in the early 1960s, while both were still climbing toward their ultimate fame. The connection between them was immediate and undeniable, a quiet spark that quickly became a powerful flame. According to those closest to her, their relationship grew into a brief but intensely passionate affair that stretched over several months. What made Sam stand apart was the way he met Aretha as an equal. He didn't approach her as a superstar to be conquered or a trophy to be displayed. He saw her as a woman first and an artist second, and he brought his own power and success to the table. He didn't need anything from her, he simply wanted to share the moment. They spent long hours talking about the contradictions of their world, about singing gospel while living in a secular industry, about fame, faith, and temptation. Their physical relationship was as honest as their conversations, electric, unashamed, and rooted in mutual respect. Aretha loved that he never tried to tame her fire or control her spirit. He loved her exactly as she was, in those stolen slices of time, with no promises and no chains. They would disappear for weekends into hotel rooms across the South, away from judgmental eyes and rigid expectations. Sam would sing to her when the doors were closed, his voice softer, more intimate than any performance on stage. In those moments, she wasn't the legend in waiting. She was simply the woman in his arms, the only person who mattered in the world he created around her. When their affair ended, it wasn't the result of betrayal or scandal. It was the inevitable outcome of 2 careers exploding at once. Sam's star was rising rapidly, and Aretha's own path demanded more and more of her. They parted like lovers who understood that life, not love, was forcing their hands. The affection between them never really died, it simply moved into a quieter corner of her memory. In later years, whenever she was asked about the men who truly touched her heart, Aretha had a particular way of pausing when Sam's name came up. The small, knowing smile, the look that said there was a story she wasn't fully telling. She once confided that Sam had taught her a powerful truth, that some loves are beautiful precisely because they are temporary, that passion doesn't always need a lifelong contract to be real. Ray Charles, the blind man who truly saw her. If Sam Cooke represented youth and heat, Ray Charles was something deeper, spiritual alignment and artistic recognition. When Aretha and Ray's paths crossed at an industry gathering in Atlanta, the chemistry was immediate but layered with complexity. Ray was already a towering figure, a man who had defied every limitation, race, genre, disability, to become a pillar of American music. What captivated Aretha most wasn't his fame, it was his vulnerability. Amid all his strength and swagger, There was something exposed and raw in Ray that mirrored her own inner world. They began spending time together whenever schedules allowed, jamming late into the night, improvising songs that no one would ever hear on an album. Those private musical conversations belonged only to them and the few who were lucky enough to be in the room. Over time, their connection crossed the line from collaboration into intimacy. Around 1964, their relationship deepened into a full-fledged affair. Ray was unlike any man she'd been with before. He refused to be intimidated by the force of her gift or the growing weight of her reputation. Instead, he challenged her. He pushed her to dig even deeper into her music, to find new corners of emotion and expression. Touring and recording schedules kept them apart for long stretches, and Ray was upfront about his life. He had women in different cities, complicated arrangements, and emotional entanglements of his own. Aretha did not demand exclusivity from him. What she wanted was honesty, and Ray gave her that. They spoke not just as lovers, but as two black artists, bearing the strain of brilliance, in a country that made their success both remarkable and exhausting. People who observed them closely described their connection as almost otherworldly. Ray didn't need to see her with his eyes to know her completely. He experienced her through sound, touch, and presence. When they were alone, he would trace the lines of her face with his fingertips, as though he were reading a score, committing every part of her to memory. Their lovemaking felt to her like an extension of their music, layered, intuitive, expressive, and deeply emotional. Even after their romantic involvement faded, the bond between them remained. They continued to intersect in life and work, each carrying the imprint of the other. Later, when Aretha spoke about the men she truly respected, there was a special reverence in the way she mentioned Ray. He had, in his own way, taught her what it truly meant to be seen, not by the eyes of the world, but by the soul of another artist. Marvin Gaye, the man who wanted forever. Marvin Gaye approached Aretha from a different angle altogether. Where Sam had offered passion and Ray offered spiritual connection, Marvin brought intensity, devotion, and a desire for permanence. When they met at a Motown event in the late 1960s, Marvin was captivated almost instantly. He had already admired her from a distance, listening to her voice on the radio, watching her transform every song into a testimony. At that time, Marvin was wrestling with his own demons, creative limitations at Motown, personal conflicts, and a longing to evolve beyond the formulas being imposed on him. Aretha represented everything he craved: authenticity, depth, and freedom. She was living proof that an artist could be both commercially successful and emotionally honest. Their relationship unfolded quickly, becoming both physically passionate and emotionally intense. Unlike some of her previous lovers, Marvin didn't just want to be part of a chapter. He wanted to write the whole book. He openly talked about marrying her, about building a life and a musical dynasty together. He showed up with flowers, poured his feelings into letters, and painted vivid pictures of a future where they were partners in every sense. For a while, Aretha leaned into the possibility. They spent stretches of time together in hotel rooms across the country, making music and sharing a bed, dreaming of projects and performances that would combine their talents. They recorded demos that never saw official release, songs that captured the vulnerable truth of what they were to each other in those days. Marvin approached her body and her heart with a kind of devotion that bordered on worship. He tried to slow everything down when they were together, wanting to stretch every hour into something eternal. But the more she understood him, the more Aretha recognized a pattern she had seen before: wounds she could not heal, demons she could not defeat on his behalf. In the end, she refused to sacrifice her own sanity, stability, and career in an attempt to rescue him. Ending the relationship was agonizing, not just for Marvin, but for her as well. Still, she knew it was necessary. Marvin, however, never completely recovered from the loss. Close friends later recalled that he spoke of Aretha as the one who slipped through his fingers, the woman he loved deeply but could not hold. The shadow of losing her followed him through many of his later struggles. Stevie Wonder, the genius who made her laugh again. By the time Stevie Wonder entered her life in a more personal way, Aretha had learned to be guarded. Fame, heartbreak, and responsibility had hardened certain parts of her. But Stevie's energy was disarming. Like Ray, he lived in darkness physically, but his spirit was full of light, playfulness, and a childlike wonder that instantly drew her in. They met at a benefit concert in Los Angeles, where Stevie was immediately taken, not just with her talent, but with her wit and sharp humor. He began showing up at her performances, inviting her to studios, looking for any excuse for their paths to cross. Eventually, this persistent, affectionate pursuit turned into something more intimate. Their affair, which lasted around a year and a half, was less driven by raw passion and more centered on joy, comfort, and genuine closeness. Stevie loved Aretha as an artist and as a woman navigating the pressures of her own name and legacy. He didn't push her for more than she could give. He understood her independence and respected her boundaries. In the studio, the two of them were electric. The music they created together carried a unique blend of their spirits, hopeful, soulful, and full of life. Some of what they made together never left the vault, remaining instead as private souvenirs of a time when their hearts and talents were perfectly aligned. In private, Stevie made her laugh in ways few others could. Their intimate moments were suffused with affection, playfulness, and a deep appreciation of each other's humanity. His way of moving through the world, guided by sound, touch, and intuition, turned their time together into something like a dance. With Stevie, Aretha felt lighter, younger, and desired not because she was a legend, but because she was simply herself. When they eventually decided to end the romance, it was without drama. They both recognized that what they'd shared was meant to remain a beautiful, finite chapter. Their friendship endured, and whenever Stevie spoke of her later, it was with unmistakable warmth and admiration. The love may have shifted shape, but it never disappeared. Barry White, the one who adored the woman, not the throne. By the time Barry White exploded into superstardom in the 1970s, Aretha had weathered heartbreak, triumph, reinvention, and loss. She carried the weight of her title, the Queen of Soul, everywhere she went. Barry approached her differently than most. His entire persona was built around sensuality, devotion, and making women feel cherished, and he turned all of that effortless charisma in her direction. They met at a music industry function, and the flirtation between them was obvious. Barry's voice alone could seduce, but with Aretha, he added an extra layer of attention and sincerity. He sent flowers, extended invitations, and made no secret of his attraction. What separated him from the others was his focus. He wasn't looking for a savior, a muse, or a spiritual partner. He simply wanted to be with her, to adore her, to enjoy the connection for what it was. Their affair was intensely physical, but not empty. Barry had a way of making her feel like the only woman in the universe when they were together. For a woman who had spent years being projected onto, demanded from, and defined by others, this uncomplicated adoration was a kind of relief. He wasn't competing with her, wasn't trying to fix her, and wasn't trying to be fixed. He was simply present. Nights with Barry were an escape from the pressures of her life. He reveled in her body, her presence, and her aura. He would take his time with her, watch her, praise her, and remind her that underneath the fame, she was still a woman worthy of pure, unburdened desire. For Aretha, this was a luxury she hadn't often allowed herself. They understood each other clearly. There were no illusions about marriage or forever. Their time together lasted a couple of years, shaped by touring and work, and when it ended, it did so without acrimony. Still, Barry left a lasting imprint. In private, Aretha acknowledged that he had restored a part of her faith in romance, not the complicated, painful kind, but the kind that lets you feel beautiful again. Luther Vandross, the devoted admirer who got close. Luther Vandross entered Aretha's life from a place of reverence. He grew up with her voice as a guiding star, her records as a blueprint for how emotion should sound. By the time they finally met, he was an established artist in his own right, but he never lost that sense of awe when it came to her. Their connection began not as lovers, but as kindred spirits. Luther admired her discipline, her strength, her survival. He understood what it meant to be held to impossible standards and still be expected to deliver perfection every time he opened his mouth. Gradually, a more intimate layer developed between them. It wasn't loud or public. It was quiet, private, and deeply respectful. Luther approached her with gentleness. He knew who she was to the world, and he was careful with her heart because of it. In their brief affair, he treated her with a tenderness that felt different from some of the grand, fiery loves she'd known. He wasn't trying to conquer a queen. He was honoring someone who had shaped his entire understanding of music. In intimate moments, Luther's adoration was almost devotional. He touched her as if each gesture mattered, like every second in her presence was something to be cherished. Sometimes he would sing softly to her, and their voices would blend in ways that felt like prayer. For Aretha, this was love filtered through gratitude. He loved her as a woman, but also as an artist, whose soul he had studied from afar long before he ever met her. When they chose to step back from the romantic aspect of their relationship, the respect never wavered. Luther continued to hold her in the highest regard, both privately and publicly. He never spoke openly about the nature of their intimacy, choosing instead to guard it as something sacred. Those who knew him well said he carried that love quietly for the rest of his life. Isaac Hayes, The Final Great Flame. And then there was Isaac Hayes, the man who lit up her later years with a surprising, powerful love. Isaac had a presence that couldn't be ignored, tall, imposing, with a voice and aura that radiated authority and sensuality. He was a man who knew exactly who he was, and Aretha recognized that confidence immediately. They came together later in life, when both of them were older, wiser, and presumed to be beyond the age of sweeping romantic dramas. But chemistry doesn't check birth certificates. Between them, there was an instant connection, grounded, mature, yet undeniably charged. Isaac, like her, had spent his life making music that celebrated emotion, sensuality, and depth. He felt like a mirror in male form. Their relationship unfolded slowly and privately. It was passionate, but it was also steady, anchored in the understanding that they were two fully formed people who didn't need each other, but chose each other. Isaac respected her independence because he fiercely guarded his own. Neither tried to overshadow or reshape the other. They met as equals who had seen enough of life to value peace over chaos. Their time together was intensely intimate but remarkably discreet. They crossed paths whenever schedules and cities aligned, and when they did, it was like slipping into a space outside of time. Isaac didn't try to define what they were, beyond the present moment. He loved her for who she was, right then. No rewrites, no projections. With him, she found a kind of acceptance that had eluded her before. In their lovemaking, there was a quiet confidence, the ease of people who understood their bodies and boundaries. Isaac held her like someone who knew exactly how rare and precious she was. When he died, the depth of Aretha's grief surprised those who had never known about the true nature of their connection. She mourned him privately, protecting their story even in her sorrow. In the years that followed, when interviewers asked her about the men who meant the most to her, she spoke of Isaac with a special softness. There was something sacred in his memory that she guarded carefully, a piece of her heart that belonged only to the two of them. 7 men, 1 woman behind the legend. Sam, Ray, Marvin, Stevie, Barry, Luther, Isaac. Each of them represented a different season of Aretha Franklin's extraordinary journey, not as a symbol, not as an icon, but as a woman with needs, fears, desires, and a capacity for love as deep and expansive as her voice. Sam gave her burning, youthful passion. Ray gave her deep spiritual understanding and artistic reflection. Marvin offered devotion and the dream of forever. Stevie gave her joy, playfulness, and emotional safety. Barry gave her adoration and uncomplicated sensual escape. Luther gave her tenderness, reverence, and the love of a lifelong fan turned equal. Isaac gave her peace, balance, and a mature love that didn't need to prove anything. Together, they sketched a hidden portrait of Aretha, one the public rarely saw, not the queen commanding a stage, but the woman who wanted to be held, understood, desired, and accepted without condition. Aretha never stood at a podium and confirmed every story or every rumor. That was never her style. But toward the end, when questions about her romantic life came up, she didn't rush to deny or sanitize anything. Instead, she smiled with the calm confidence of someone who had lived fully and loved on her own terms. She refused to apologize for her choices, her desires, or the fact that the Queen of Soul was also a flesh and blood woman who needed connection just like anyone else. At 76, Aretha Franklin was done with pretending. She had faced down critics, illness, heartbreak, and history itself. She had been loved by some of the greatest musical minds of her generation, and she had loved them back with the same force she brought to every song. That, as much as the records and awards, was part of her true legacy. Not just the voice, not just the hits, but the woman behind them. Complex, passionate, vulnerable, unapologetically human. Now it's your turn. Which part of Aretha's hidden love life changes the way you see her the most? Do you think she was brave for keeping these stories close until she was ready to let them slip through in her own way? Share your thoughts. And if you want more deep dives into the secret histories behind music's biggest legends, you already know what to do. Stick around, because the truth behind the melodies is only getting started.